Today's episode is sponsored by Jason Jones Bits and Spurs. Jason is an old friend of mine, and in addition to being a bit and spur maker, he's a fine musician. He says that he's been making custom cowboy hardware for over 25 years, 100% for the working cowboy. Jason makes bits, spurs, buckles, jewelry, and other items, all handmade at his shop in Lincoln County, New Mexico, near the town of Nogales. You can check him out online at jasonjonesspurs.com. I'd like to start today's show with a poem written by Chuck Haas. Chuck Haas was a friend of Charlie Russell's and a recipient of one of Charlie's illustrated letters. This piece is entitled Damned Barbed Wire, and Chuck Haas commented on this poem and said, "In memory of my pappy and all the old leather-pounding clan, especially Charlie Russell, who hated barbed wire worse than poison. It's no more we'll ride o'er the back trails, boys, that cut through the hills and higher, for a wanton crew with wild thoughts aspew have fenced it complete with wire. Wire that glits in the bright sunlight, wire that hides it, a vile snake bite, wire, that leg-bustin' curse of night, wire, boys, damned barbed wire. They have shut us out of the old range, boys, and hung up a hell-sent warning. No trespassing here, but it won't be there for the sun to bright come morning. Wire that's built of the devil's skill, wire that snarls as it makes a kill, wire that gloats o'er its cruel will. Wire, boys, damned barbed wire. They have fenced the land and its freedom, boys, and the cows will bawl tomorrow, and the mustangs squeal at 3 strands of steel, and us cowboys ride in sorrow. Wire, that vicious blight from the east, wire that butchers for buzzards' feast, wire that cripples both man and beast. Wire, boys, damned barbed wire. Now the hills, the mesas, the valleys, boys, wear a shadow long befallen, and we'll ride our years to the taunting jeers of the wind-swept strands a-howlin'. Wire that cuts like a keen-edged knife, wire that fetched bitter hate and strife, wire that ended our free-range life. Wire, boys, damned barbed wire. Howdy, folks. This is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Randy Rieman. Randy Rieman is a horseman, a rawhide braider, and one of the finest reciters of traditional cowboy poetry. Randy was a guest on the podcast back on episodes 13 and 14, where he talked about his career as a working cowboy, working with Bill Dorrance, rawhide braiding, and cowboy poetry. If you haven't already, I'd recommend going back and listening to those episodes. For the last several years, Randy has been doing presentations on the illustrated letters of the great Western artist, Charles M. Russell. In this interview, I asked Randy to talk about the life and work of Charles M. Russell and read from his letters. Here's Randy Rieman.
His full name was Charles Marion Russell, and he was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. He was born in 1964, so right at the end of the Civil War, basically. His family, they were pretty well-to-do. His dad was in industry. I think he had a brickyard, and He was his father's first cousin was William Bent from Bent's Fort, and William Bent and Kit Carson were sort of on the edge of the frontier. St. Louis was considered the gateway to the West, and so when Charlie was born, the Civil War had ended. There was a big migration westward. And, of course, Charlie saw all these frontiersmen and pioneers who were going and coming in St. Louis, and he had heard these adventurous tales of free trappers and traders who would come through St. Louis, and he knew about his uncle who was there at Bent's Fort. And so he grew up with a fascination for the frontier, and he wasn't formally real well educated, but he was very self-educated, and he was a terrible student. He was no, I shouldn't say that. He didn't like school, and he had a hard time with reading and writing and arithmetic. That wasn't his thing, and he ran away a lot. They'd send him to a school, and he'd disappear, and he'd go find a job somewhere and come back. And this was all before he was 16 years old. I mean, he was really fascinated by and sort of obsessed with the westward movement and seeing it all before it was gone. That was really at the foremost of his mind. And so when he was about 15 and a half years old, his dad got him a job in Montana. He wanted to go to Montana Territory, and through his father's business connections, he knew a sheep rancher out in central Montana, and he sent Charlie there. Finally acquiesced and let him go pursue his dream. And he lasted about 5 days on this ranch. And in one of the letters that I read about Charlie, he said, I kept losing the sheep, And so anyway, he quit. And he's just drifting along on his own, basically, with a saddle horse and whatever he needed, and he ran into a guy named Jake Hoover, and Jake Hoover was a frontiersman, and he was a hunter and a trapper, and this is Montana in 1880. That was the year Charlie arrived in Montana. And so to put that in historical perspective, it was 4 years after Custer's battle at the Rosebud Creek, and so Custer's last stand was just fresh in everyone's mind and was a big event in the West in just 4 years prior to Charlie's arrival. And then it was 10 years, his arrival was 10 years before the massacre at Wounded Knee. And those two things sort of marked the end of the hostilities between the native peoples and the immigrants and the cavalry who went west. So Charlie hit Montana at a really neat time where he saw the last of the sort of free peoples, plains, nomadic kind of plains Indians. And historically, there was lots of migration, so he was watching the country change, watching the culture change out west, becoming more and more European dominated and less native peoples dominated. And so it was a pretty exciting time. There was a lot going on there. And it was the sort of the epicenter of the open range cattle industry when he got to Montana. So Dad gets him a job on a sheep ranch. He doesn't stick, he leaves. And he hooks up with this Jake Hoover, who's this mountain man, trapper, plainsman. And Jake hunted wild game and then sold it to the ranchers and the railroad crews and whoever was in the area of central Montana at the time. So Charlie lived with Jake for about 2 years in the Judith Basin area of Montana, which is central Montana. And that was how he sort of got his feet under him in Montana. It's hard to believe he was just 16 years old, when he got there. But ever since he was a little boy, he was sketching and drawing. And there are lots of examples of his early work as a little kid. And then when he got to Montana, he continued sketching and drawing. And he took jobs with, we would say ranches today, but they called them cattle pools back then. And a bunch of ranchers would just turn their livestock out on open range, and they just let them graze until the calves were big enough to send to the marketplace, which was a lot older than we do today. You know, those big steers that they shipped to the marketplace back then were 5 or 6 years old sometimes, and we butcher everything today, you know, in under 24 months, basically. So totally different industry, and it was just vast open plains, no fences, no obstructions except natural ones for the cattle. So these cattle just went where they wanted and followed the grass and followed the water, and the cowboys would get dispersed out to round up the cattle in a certain area, and they pool them, put them together. Every cow was branded with some rancher's brand, and they would sort the calves and cows into the proper orders, and then those ranchers would remove whatever they were taking. If they were taking steers, they'd take them. If they were shipping to market, if they were, you know, driving their cattle to another part of the range. So that was Charlie's first job as a cowboy, was working with these big crews. They had a bed wagon and a chuck wagon and a big cavy of horses, and Charlie was a night herder for the horses. So his job was they might have 150 head of horses put together for 2 or 3 ranches, and someone else might have another big cavy of horses put together for another big set of ranches, and then they would keep those horses from wandering off in the night so that the guys could catch their horses in the morning and go to work. So that was really Charlie's first job, was as a night wrangler for these cattle pools. All the while he was doing that, he was still sketching and sculpting and drawing, painting, but it was all really informal. He had received no formal training for his artwork, but he was really gifted, no doubt. And as his career moved forward, his lifespan, you know, was basically born and raised in St. Louis for 15 years, right at the end of the Civil War, and then Montana in 1880, where he pretty much stayed. He did travel, and he left the state all the way up until his death in 1926. So Charlie lived to be about 62 years old. And in his art career, which went from being a kind of a novel pastime for him, was clearly a passion, no doubt. By 1903 or 1904, Charlie was taking his artwork seriously. And so he created a body of work that, as an eyewitness to and a participant in the open range cattle industry in the West before fencing and before really any farming in Montana, Charlie was able to observe that and record that through his artwork. So it's really historic. He is so historically significant because he was one of the few celebrated artists, and he became one of the most highly celebrated cowboy artists. He actually lived the life. For 11 years, he spent it living the cowboy lifestyle. And in his career, from 1880 until 1926, Charlie completed 4,000 known works. And he did major watercolors, major oils, did pen and ink, he did sculptures, he did pencil drawings. He did a mural for the state capitol in Montana that was 12 feet tall and 25 feet long, and it's just major oil painting of Lewis and Clark meeting the Flathead Indians at Ross's Hole, which are very significant to Montana's history. And he was also incredibly successful financially. It didn't start that way. And Charlie would trade a painting for drinks for his friends, or he would sell a painting for $25 in, 1896, and share it with his friends, or support him through the winter when they weren't cowboying. I mean, he just didn't take it real serious early in his career. He was just having fun. But he had so much talent, people started recognizing that talent, pursuing his work, and in the end became kind of a world celebrity for the authenticity of his painting and for his ability to capture motion in a still painting or drawing or sketching. And he began to be noticed by the art community back east, and I can get into kind of how that happened.
In an introduction to a book of Charlie Russell's illustrated letters entitled Paper Talk, Russell scholar Brian Dippy wrote this: "Even before Charlie became prominent, recipients of his letters often saved them. A surprising number survives. Letters sent to cowboy pals who accepted Russ as one of their own, yet always knew he was a little special. Of course, many more of the letters written after he had become a famous artist are extant. Those fortunate enough to get them kept them, and Charlie also wrote more letters in his later years. He generally confined himself to writing personal friends, although it is clear from his letters that he was usually well behind in his replies. But as this collection attests, Russell Paper Talk was worth waiting for."
I discovered Charlie, I don't even remember the first piece I saw of his art, but I kind of was born with a fascination for anything cowboy. And so I was always looking at cowboy art or cowboy pictures or whatever, and Charlie's stuff was so widely distributed by the time I came along. He started in 1880, and right away calendars were made with his artwork locally, first in Montana and then distributed all around the U.S. But I saw probably just a print on a calendar or maybe working as a cowboy in Montana. It's almost impossible to go to a ranch or a bunkhouse or a feed store or or a tack shop or a saddle shop without having exposure to a Charlie Russell piece. And, I just don't know any bunkhouse I've ever been in that's got Charlie Russell artwork in it. It might be just a calendar, but it's got Charlie's art. And so right away, when you work as a cowboy and you work on these ranches, consciously or unconsciously, you kind of develop an eye for what's authentic and what's a good representation and what's not. And of course, with Charlie, he had a nearly photographic memory. He called himself an illustrator. He never really called himself an artist. He called himself an illustrator. And in his mind, he was painting pictures that represented what he saw, and accuracy and detail was super important to him. The way a horse moves and the way a horse looks during a certain moment of an experience he's having, Charlie just knew all that firsthand. And when that's what you do for a living, you pick up on that right away. And you can look at a Frederick Remington painting who was really influential in Charlie's art, but he was a trained artist from the East who was a casual part-time observer of what happened in the West, where Charlie was a full-time participant in what happened for over a decade. And he clearly had this gift of capturing in his mind what he saw and remembering those little details that make all the big differences. And so when I saw Charlie's work right from the beginning, I knew there was something really unique and special about it. There was something different about it. There was so much detail and accuracy and humor, and you just couldn't help but pick up on that. And so I became a real fan of his visual art because that's all I knew about. And then I found a book that was printed after Charlie's death, and it was a collection of some of his illustrated letters. And that was the first exposure I had to the fact that Charlie sent illustrated letters to his friends. And literally from 1880 until his death, Charlie strengthened his relationship with friends and clients, art clients, and old cowboys that he'd worked with in the past, and Hollywood celebrities and politicians. Everybody who became a part of Charlie's life ended up as a recipient sometime, for some reason, of one of these illustrated letters, or perhaps many of those illustrated letters. And we know now, in retrospect, largely because of a fellow named Brian Dippy, who's probably the foremost authority on Charlie and his life and his art. He spent a lifetime researching Charlie and finding not just the information, but photographs and these illustrated letters. We know there were 400 letters that are known and photographed and put in books and all of that. And so my first experience with those letters was this book called Good Medicine. I started reading and I realized Charlie was more than just a painter. He was more than just a sculptor. I knew he was a cowboy, and I knew that he was really passionate and loyal to his vision of all that and his experience in all that. But I had no idea that he sent these illustrated letters to his friends. So they were perhaps to just an old buddy he'd cowboyed with, and I'll read an example of some of those later. And then they might be to someone who had made contact with Charlie for a specific reason, because he was kind of known as a Plains Indian authority. He really knew a lot about the Plains Indians. And there's an example of a letter from a fella in Texas who had a painting by Carl Weimers, who was a St. Louis artist before Charlie's time, but Charlie'd grown up looking at his artwork. And so this fella sent a letter to Charlie asking him about the painting, if he could tell him what kind of native Indians were in that painting. And so it's intriguing to me that he would go to the effort of illustrating, not just answering a question from someone, but he'd actually paint a story or paint a painting or several little vignettes on a page where he'd write the answers down and then illustrate the answers in watercolor or maybe oils or maybe a pencil sketch. So my initial response to that was, this is a microcosm of the West. These letters represent a guy who lived through this great transition period where the homesteaders came and Montana statehood arrived, and he watched the free roaming Indians get placed on reservations, and he watched the last of the open range cowboys sort of run out of opportunity there because everything changed so much. So here was this guy telling stories and sharing stories through these letters with all kinds of people of his first-hand eyewitness accounts of what the West was like during his lifetime. And to add to his visual representations of what the West was like, you have these poems and stories that he wrote down to friends or clients or whomever, accompanied by the visual part too, which kind of takes the whole storytelling art of what Charlie was the best at, was telling a story, whether it was verbally or in a letter or just a painting. That it's hard to look at one of Charlie's paintings or sculptures without seeing the story. He was really great at getting the story clear to the viewer or the listener. And that just fascinated me. I've always loved the spoken word. I've always loved poetry. I've always loved a good story. And I really admire a visual artist who can capture what they see, and you can get the same feeling they had when they saw it when you look at that piece of work, just like a good poem gives you the same feeling that the poet is conveying. If it's well done, it helps you feel what he was feeling at the time it was taking place. 100 years later, you can feel like you were there. That's the way Charlie's art always was to me, and that's the way his letter writing is to me. He had a really unique vernacular. He just spoke in cowboy vernacular, and he didn't change that. It didn't matter if he was writing a letter to an old-time cowpuncher that he hadn't seen in years, or to the state senator. He used the same language. He used the same lack of punctuation. He used the same phonetic spelling. And you had to kind of work your way through the letter. His writing was a little bit like J.B. Allen. You had to work pretty hard at discerning the words sometimes. But the authenticity and the realness of the man and his life experience just comes through. You just can't miss it. You just can't miss it. Yeah. Early in Charlie's career, his art was pretty straightforward and simple. As I said, he was not a tutored artist. He wasn't schooled. He didn't go to anywhere. He just sort of did it on his own. And then as his art career began to get some attention, his sort of raw genius was really apparent. And a lot of other artists who were far more trained and experienced, that he made friends with those guys, and they had influence in his art. And so as his art progressed, as his life progressed, it became more and more refined and more sophisticated, and so did his writing. But he never lost that. The style never changed. The length changed sometimes. The spelling never changed, that's for sure. And the punctuation never changed, which is really kind of great because he stayed the same. But he started dealing with maybe more weighty matters sometimes. But most of the time it was correspondence. And I'll read a letter. This letter's from early in the 1880s, and it was sent to a friend of his. The guy's name was Pony Bill Davis, and he was a really interesting guy himself. And somehow he ended up with Charlie Russell on the Bear Paws cattle pool, also as a cowboy and sometimes as a night herder and a horse wrangler. But they worked in this Judith Basin country really early in Charlie's career. And so he sent this letter to Pony Bill Davis, and I'll just read it to you. It says, "Friend Pony, I received your letter and was glad to hear from you. I am still in Montana and still working on the range. We are at present busy gathering horses for the spring roundup. The cattle have all been driven north to the Milk River, and I leave for there in a few days. It's a pretty good cow country. The fellow that told you I was sketching for a magazine was mistaken, as I have tried several times to make a living painting, but I could not make it stick and had to go back to the range. I expect I will have to ride till the end of my days, but I would rather be a poor cowpuncher than a poor artist. Well, old boy, there's nothing to write about, and as you know, I'm a very poor writer. I will close, hoping to hear from you. I remain your friend, C.M. Russell, Utica, Montana, Fergus County." And along with this letter was a little sketch. There were some flowers drawn up in one corner of the letter, and then there's a string of pack horses. And back in the day, when there were no fences and a lot fewer people, nobody led their pack horses. They drove their pack horses. And so they just packed everything up and they drove them in front of them where they were going. And so there's this letter with a couple cowboys behind a long string of pack horses, and they're moving camp. And so that was the illustration that came with that letter. I'll read another early letter, and this letter was to another friend of Charlie's who was also on the Judith Basin Roundup with him. And this fellow was a lot like Charlie. He came from a fairly well-to-do family, and he ended up out west because he was fascinated with the frontier, and he worked as a cowboy and went on to other things later. But he and Charlie maintained contact through the years. And this letter was from about 1890. And again, I'll just read the letter to you. Maybe first I'll describe the letter. It's handwritten, of course, as everything was then, and it has a little group of cowboys on a plain on the prairie, and they're riding towards you as you look at the letter. And so there's a little just vignette there that was probably a pencil sketch, I would imagine. It's kind of hard to tell now. But this is what the letter said. "Friend Charlie, I received your letter and was glad to hear from you. I left the Judith Basin country like all cowpunchers. I followed the herds of cattle as all the big herds have moved out across the Missouri River. I am now in the Milk River. This is a good cow country, and as the greater part is badlands and can't be settled, it will last. I have roamed around a good bit since I saw you. I went up north across the line and lived 6 months with the Blackfeet. I still have my same horses, Monty and Eagle. Monty looks the same as ever. I still night herd, and often in the long nights last fall I thought of you. I suppose you want to hear about the boys. Poor Ed is dead. He died about a year ago. I have lost 2 brothers since I saw you. It's pretty hard, but we all have to stand such things in life. Jim Sheldon has left this country, and all the cowpunchers are up here with me. I was surprised to hear that you were married, but I think it was the best thing you ever did, and I hope that you will settle down now and live like a white man. I never expect to be that lucky. I expect if I ever get married, it will be to this kind. And right here in the letter is a little portrait of a Native American Indian woman, and in very traditional garb. So I'll start from back a little bit. I expect if I ever get married, it will be to this kind, as there is a great many up here, and I seem to take well among them. I had a chance to marry young Louse's daughter. Young Louse is a Blackfoot chief. It was my only chance I ever had to marry into a good family. But I did not like the way my intended cooked dog, so we broke off our engagement. Well, old boy, I cannot think of anything to write about. I go out on the roundup the 20th, but my address will be Chinook, Choteau County. Hoping to find you well, I remain as ever your friend, C.M. Russell. There's some things about this letter that are really cool, and one is that in 1886 and 1887 was the terrible winter that sort of ended the open range era in Montana. And when Charlie refers to all the cowpunchers have left the Missouri River country because it was so used up after the circumstances that led to this terrible winter, and they were all looking for fresh range and better grass. And this is a little side note about Charlie and his historical sort of value. Like if you know a little bit about the Western history of Montana and the time period, which is easy to find out now, we get information so easily. The winter of 1886 ended the open range country because it was a severe die-off of cattle. There were several circumstances involved. The range had been overstocked because people were making a lot of money in the cattle industry. There was a railhead that was shipping cattle back to the east, but the market was glutted, and so guys left their cattle out on the range. And then because there were too many cattle there, the grass was overgrazed, the winter came along, and it was one of the fiercest on record. There were month-long periods of minus 30 and minus 40 degree weather. There were terrible storms, and that was nothing brand new, but what was different was there's a wind in the west called a Chinook, and it's a warm wind that thaws out the ice and melts the snow and exposes the grasses, and they never happened that year. So the too many cattle on the range, the weather was just at its fiercest, and so there was this huge die-off. Most historians think that a minimum of 70% of most of the livestock froze to death or starved to death. So that changed the landscape. It takes time for that dry country to recover the grasses. So all these big ranches that had been having a pretty good circumstance, they were moving to new ranges, and a lot of it was to the north and some of it was to the east. So that's revealed in this letter. And then he talks about living 6 months with the Blackfeet Indian, and it was up in Canada. When he says he crossed the line, he's referring to the Medicine Line, the border between the U.S. and Canada. And then Charlie was just a real empathizer and really sympathetic to the Native Americans' plight. He envied their free lives before the Europeans came, and he admired them greatly, and he found them super colorful, and they were really a symbol of this wild country that he longed to go to when he was a young boy. And so Charlie did a lot of paintings of the Blackfeet in particular, and the Cree and the Chippewa, and so he had a real affection for and great friendships in the Native American culture at the time, which was a little bit unusual for someone who was a non-native who had come to the area. There wasn't a lot of sympathy sometimes for the native situation. And the Cree and the Chippewa were called the landless Indians, and they kind of just got pushed around quite a bit. And over time, Charlie was one of the determining factors in a place being found for those people groups that were literally wandering back and forth between Montana and Canada, which is what they had done traditionally for a long time. But the circumstances had changed so much that they weren't welcome. And so they were sort of harassed and driven off. And through Charlie and some other frontier Montana men, reservation was put together for these landless Indians. So that's a big part of Montana history too, and a little bit of the background of it shows up in a lot of Charlie's letters.
In an introduction to the first published book of Charlie Russell's illustrated letters, Good Medicine, his old friend Will Rogers wrote these words: "But with old Charlie, if he had quit talking to you and started painting, you would have got sore. It wasn't what you wanted. What you wanted was to hear him talk or read what he said. He could paint you a picture and send you a letter with it, and you would value the letter more than you would the picture."
Absolutely, the impact was enormous, and the recipient in particular. I mean, there are lots of stories as I've done this research, and I'm just copying what someone else did before me. I'm not a historian, and I'm not an art critic, but Brian Dippy, who really, for me, is kind of the go-to guy on Charlie and his illustrated letters for sure. And his books that were published about them were through the Amon Carter Museum down in Fort Worth, and also through the Charlie Russell Museum in Great Falls. But those were like the most treasured items those frontiersmen had. And I say that because Charlie wrote to guys who had gotten there 40 years ahead of him and were already kind of legends in Montana, and people like Granville Stewart and Robert Vaughn. Robert Vaughn was the first white European settler in the Great Falls area of Montana, and there's a little town named after him there, Vaughn, Montana. But he had been a gold prospector before that, and he ended up as a rancher, but he had driven a freight wagon. And so these guys were guys who captured Charlie's imagination, and then they corresponded. And as is obvious by the fact that these 100 and however many year-old letters, 150-year-old letters, are still in pristine condition, and they were saved and cherished and protected. Certainly some have been lost, we know that, but even when Nancy Russell, Charlie's wife, wanted to put a book together of these letters, the toughest job she had was getting these guys to turn loose of them long enough that she could make copies of them and write down the content, because they just didn't want to take a chance on losing that item. And so not just the buddies that he cowboyed with, or these guys like Granville Stewart, who's a really famous Montana character, people like Will Rogers and Harry Carey Jr. and Tom Mix and many other Hollywood sort of elites at the time. By the time the 1920s came around, Charlie had made some world travel, and he had been back east, he had been down south, he had been to London, he was up in Winnipeg, Canada, and up to the Pendleton Roundup in Oregon, selling his art, and down to Hollywood. Pasadena, that area. In the 1920s, there were 160 different film companies in Hollywood making cowboy movies. And so we know this, most people do, that a lot of those range cowboys ended up in Hollywood getting a bit part in a movie or being a writer in a scene or whatever. And so Nancy was really savvy, Charlie's wife. She was the business mind behind Charlie's success. And so she was always looking for where that good art market was, and she would take a bunch of Charlie's work there and establish a gallery showing and sell art. And so they got exposed to the Hollywood crowd. The Hollywood crowd got exposed to them, and of course embraced Charlie because he was the real deal. He was the guy who lived what they were presenting on film, And so even though these were maybe wealthy people, they treasured these letters about like everybody else did. It was just like too good to be true. I got an illustrated letter from Charlie Russell, and which now trades for obscene value, with art dealers. A little illustrated envelope from Charlie, most people don't pay more for their house than that's worth these days, and so, which is really cool because they are really special. And even 100 years later, plus I came to Montana exactly 100 years after Charlie did, and I'd seen his artwork before I came to Montana, but I got really invested in the man when I became a part of Montana. I was kind of an adopted son like Charlie. I came from the same area of the country, within 110 miles of where Charlie came from. And my mother's maiden name was Russell, and she was from a little town called Princeton, Missouri. And so have no idea if there were lots of Russells, and have no idea if there's any connection there at all, and I really doubt it. But even today, boy, if I could pick a piece of art that regardless of value I would want for my own, it would be one of these illustrated letters, I think. I just fell in love with them. And most people who hear them and read them do the same. I love history from the people that lived it, because there's a lot of history that gets sort of, I think Will Rogers was the one that said history isn't what it was, it's what a writer said it was for us. And the guys who write what they actually experienced and saw, that's really the legitimate part of history that I'm interested in. I'm not really interested in a perspective from outside, and I'm not saying doesn't have value, but I really want to hear about the guy who was there, and that's where these letters, the language he uses, and I'll read some more for you. The language he uses, the sentiments behind even the subject matter, they were straight out of the heart and mind of someone who was in that experience at the time, living it, right now in real time. Charlie was a master at getting his point across, and whether it was a serious topic or a social topic, he was really great at the ability to get his point across with simple language and oftentimes with lots of humor as well, which was why he and Will Rogers became such good friends. Will Rogers wrote the foreword to one of Charlie's books, and he was, of course, a worldwide celebrity and an incredible speaker. But by his own admission, he said, when Charlie Russell's in the room, I keep my mouth shut, because Will Rogers thought Charlie was the best storyteller he'd ever seen. And of course, Will Rogers made his living telling stories, but he thought Charlie was the best at it. And so that's so much fun to get a well-crafted letter from somebody telling a real story, and then you've got a $1 million painting on the letter too. That's just pretty remarkable to me. In about 1914, Charlie painted a painting that I believe it's in the McKay collection at the C.M. Russell Museum in Helena now, and it's called When the Land Belonged to God. And the painting is a herd of bison, and they're coming up a knoll, and there's a big backdrop and a really bright sunset and or sunrise. I'm not sure which. Charlie was asked one time, and he said, darned if I know. But it's this great painting. There's a wolf in the foreground, and there's this herd of bison that are coming up over this hill. And it's a major oil painting, very large. And a fella named Ralph Budd had written Charlie a letter and was inquiring about this bison painting. And so Charlie sent a letter back, and I'd like to read that letter because it reveals a little bit about how Charlie saw the West and the things that were there that he got to be an eyewitness of. And it also reflects he has a really nostalgic and romantic view of what had changed, what the past that had changed. In fact, when he did his one-man show at the Door Gallery in London in 1914, the title of the show was The West That Was. Charlie knew that the West that was currently taking place was not nearly as romantic or as picturesque as the one he saw early in his career. So he didn't really paint what was happening in dryland farming or the growth of towns. What he painted was what he saw when he first got there. And of course, what he saw was big bunches of bison. And he wrote this letter to Ralph Budd. It says, "Dear Mr. Budd, this is Thanksgiving Day, and I am thinking of you and thanking you for the good time you gave us last summer. The turkey is the emblem of this day, and it should be in the East, but the West owes nothing to that bird. It owes much to the humpback beef in this sketch above. The buffalo is essential to the life of the Plains Indian. The Rocky Mountains would have been hard to reach without him. He fed the explorer. The great fur trade wagon trains felt safe when they reached his range. He fed the men that laid the first ties across this great West. There is no day set aside where the buffalo is an emblem. The nickel wears his picture, and it's damn small money for so much meat. He was one of nature's biggest gifts, and this country owes him thanks." So that reflects a little bit about Charlie's thought process. Why did Charlie paint this major painting of bison? Because he had such a high opinion of them, and it went beyond their sort of visual beauty. It was how elemental they were to a whole people group. They were really the center of the Plains Indians' existence, and that was a large reason why they were eliminated in mass numbers, was because it was pretty easy to pacify a people whose sustenance was removed, So there's all kinds of interesting things to me about, not just from a perspective, my perspective perhaps as somebody living in 2021, but Charlie could see beyond just what was right in front of him. He really had a long-term view and a really deep, I think, discernment about what was happening in the West. So Charlie was mostly known in Montana until about 1903 or 1904. In that time period, Charlie had married Nancy, and she had kind of taken over the business part of his art career. He had quit the range in 1893, to pursue his art full time. And then he and Nancy married in 96. And from that point on, you see this dramatic improvement, I want to say, or refinement in Charlie's artwork. Because instead of just doing it on a whim or doing it for fun or making a trade with somebody or paying a bar bill with his art, he started pursuing it very seriously at that time. And Nancy could see how unique he was and how gifted he was. And so she kind of took over the business part of his world, because Charlie's was not pursuing money. He had this passionate desire to share the West that he had seen with people through his art. And he didn't really take himself that seriously, but he began to take his art more seriously. And in 1903, the World's Fair, first one really, it wasn't even called that, but that's kind of what it was in St. Louis, Missouri, back in his hometown. And so he put together some work. Nancy fixed it so there was a huge display of current art at the World's Fair, and Charlie got some of his pictures in this gallery for celebration at the World's Fair 1903 St. Louis. That changed things for Charlie because he got exposed to a broader section of the art world. A lot of his exposure in Montana, he had seen Remington's work, he'd seen Carl Weimer's work, he got quarterly magazines and he read them. He was really keen on self-education, but he studied other artists and he studied classic art, and he was totally aware of what Remington did and how well he did it. He was totally aware of who was painting what. He knew, like I say, Carl Weimers, who painted in the 1840s and had a very short career with the Native Americans, but did good work. And so Charlie was pulling from all those resources he could where he was, but he pretty limited because there weren't a lot of people in Montana. And so he got back to St. Louis in 1903, and he met some artists from the East and from other places, and they met him and saw his work and began friendships with those people. And so in 1903, it was St. Louis. In 1904, it was a gallery in New York. And in New York, he met a fellow named Philip Goodwin, and he was the premier sporting artist in America, and he was really young. He was just in his 20s. He was like this kid protege, and in his teens, he just rose through the ranks of sporting goods illustrators and sporting art, which was a really big thing in the U.S., and so he was hired by the Colt Company or the Remington Company, and he did posters for their rifles and ammo, and he did other commercial things, but he used a lot of color. And he and Charlie met in this time period, 1903, 1904, and right there you see this change in Charlie's painting because he starts getting more bold with his colors. And it was largely through his relationship with, his friendship with, which they got a great friendship that lasted the rest of Charlie's life, exchanged many letters and talked about art together in those letters. And Charlie was using a lot of earth tones and very subdued colors, and then he started getting more bold in his color schemes, and that's when these fabulous sunset and sunrise paintings started to show up in Charlie's art career. So you can kind of track his evolution of his talent through that time period. And I'll read you this letter from 1903. Now, he started writing these letters about 1880, and they were pretty short and to the point, most of them. It's kind of legendary how difficult writing was for Charlie. It was real work for him, and he would admit that. It was much easier for him to paint a painting than it was to write a letter. But he would do both to keep these relationships going and strengthening. And he had a friend in Great Falls named Albert Trigg, and Albert Trigg owned the Brunswick Bar. And he was also a neighbor to Charlie and Nancy, and they became good friends. Albert Trigg was originally from England and then moved to Canada and then moved down to Great Falls. So on this trip back to St. Louis, Charlie writes this letter to his friend back in Montana and reminiscing about some things, and I'll just read the letter to you. It says, "Dear friend Trigg, I thought I would write and let you know that I'm still among the live ones. I have taken in the World's Fairgrounds, and it is very grand, but don't interest me much. The Animal Gardens, which is near there, is much more to my liking. They have a very good collection, among them a coyote who licked my hand like he knew me. I guess I brought the smell of the plains with me. I sure felt sorry for the poor devil, a life sentence for nothing on earth but looks and general principles. But you can't do nothing for a fella whose whole family is outlaws as far back as anybody remembers, even if he is a neighbor of yours. If he could make hair bridles, it would be a lot easier, but with nothing to do but think of home, it's terrible. I'm stopping with my folks who live very near the place where I was raised. The country is much built up, but there's some of the old landmarks left and little patches of woods enough to take me back to my boyhood days. I was much surprised the other morning to scare up about 10 quail, but as there is no shooting allowed, that accounts for the quail. Seeing these birds in this woods reminds me of a winter when I was a youngster of about 9 years, hunting with a party of kids. We had one gun. This weapon was the old-time muzzle-loading musket. There was but one boy in the party long enough to load her, and without the aid of a stump or a log. So, of course, he did the loading. He packed the ammunition. We were shooting in turns at anything in sight. Well, I kept bellyaching, saying, "My turn, my turn." And the big kid says, "You'll get yours." And I did. When he loaded for me, I remember how the rod jumped clear of the barrel. He must have spent 5 minutes tamping the load. Then handing the gun to me, he says, "There, that would kill a tiger." And I think it would have if he'd been on the same end I was. Our game was crows. I climbed to the top of a rail fence to get clean range, and then, as the books say, for an instant my hawk eye measured the glistening barrel, then the death-like stillness was broken by the crack of my faithful weapon. And I kept it broken with howls for quite a while. And I have to interject here. I'll describe this letter to you. At the beginning of the letter, at the letterhead, there's a picture of the Mississippi River with a riverboat on it in front of a town, obviously St. Louis. And then when Charlie talks about the coyote, there's a little vignette of a coyote out on the plains. And he goes from being out on the plains to being in a cage, and Charlie's standing next to him, and that's when the coyote's licking Charlie's hand. Then the next little vignette, and these are all painted underneath the writing of the letter itself. So you have to look through his writing to see these little watercolors. Then he has a picture of the quail, and then he has a picture of the old-time muzzleloader and the powder horn. And then he has this incredible picture that is a typical wood scene in that area of the country with a big old sycamore tree and a rail fence. And there's 3 or 4 boys with some hounds running around. And there's one boy sitting on the fence, and he's just touched off this muzzleloader, and it's blown him clear off the fence, and he's flying through the air. So that's where the howls kept up for quite a long time. But this is just a really classic letter of Charlie's and very typical of his sense of humor. You can see it in his paintings, and you can really get it in his letters. There's hardly a letter that doesn't have some little humorous anecdote in it.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'll pick up where I left off with Randy in part 2 of our interview in the next episode. I'd like to thank Randy Rieman for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Randy at randyrieman.com. I'd like to thank Jason Jones Bits and Spurs for sponsoring today's episode. You can find out more about Jason Jones at jasonjonesspurs.com. I'd like to thank Hal Cannon for playing the Cowboy Crossroads theme music. You can find out more about Hal at halcannon.com. I'd like to thank my Trail Boss patrons, Bob Kelly and Chris Ryden, for their support of this show. If you're enjoying Cowboy Crossroads and would like to help me keep it going, you can become a patron at patreon.com/cowboycrossroads. That's patreon.com/cowboycrossroads. You can also make a donation on my website at andyhedges.com. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.